Hello, good evening. I'm Todd Lefko, Chairperson of East-West Connections. Thank you for joining us tonight. On behalf of our co-sponsors, Global Minnesota, the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, the Museum of Russian Art, the McAllister Department of Russian Studies, and the Russian American Journal, the Journal of American Russian Studies, which is an excellent magazine, and I recommend it in terms of a journal. A special thank you to our technical and marketing wizard, Catherine Galligan, and a special thanks to the wonderful Professor Ben Wisenhunt, without whom this program would not have taken place. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our moderator and one of the brightest young minds in the field of Russian-American relations and international affairs, the brilliant Paula Garcia. Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Todd, for such a wonderful introduction. So it is my pleasure to be here today with you guys because we have the greatest panelists ever. It's going to be a very interesting event today, so I'm very happy that you guys are joining. I'm going to be introducing our panelists. So we have David Fogelsong, Professor of History for Rutgers University. Professor Fogelsong is a co-author with Professors Kurila and Victoria Suravieva of Distant Friends and Intimate Enemies, A History of American-Russian Relations, which was published last year by Cambridge. His current research centers on how U.S. and Soviet citizen diplomats contributed to the overcoming of enmity between their nations in the 1980s. We also have the pleasure of having as a panelist today with us Ivan Kurila, visiting professor at The Ohio State University. Professor Kurila is a historian of U.S.-Russia relations, national identity, and the political issues of history. He previously taught at the European University at St. Petersburg and has held appointments at Dartmouth, George Washington University, Bowdoin College, Wellesley College, and Middlebury College. So we have amazing panelists today, and we're going to be focusing mainly on the discussion of their fresh new book titled Distant Friends and Intimate Enemies, A History of American-Russian Relations, which is extremely important and extremely relevant today. So, Professors David and Ivan, the floor is yours. Whoever would like to begin talking about your amazing masterpiece.
Give it to Ivan. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting us, and that is a great pleasure for me, and I believe for David as well, to share the results of the long work we've done for more than 10 years since we started writing this book. And the situation in the world and situation in Russian-American relations has profoundly changed through the time we were writing. That actually added us some, new angles, new visions of the events of the past, of the 19th century and 20th century, which we described in details. And that is, that actually I believe that made our book stronger than if we just published it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and just first had the idea. This is a book, this is the first book since John Lewis Geddes' book published in the middle of the 1970s, which attempts to describe, to analyze the whole history of Russian-American relations from the first contacts to the recent time. And that's, I believe, could be useful for anybody who are interested in the history of Russian-American relations, or who teaches or studies history of Russian-American relations. So this is a first attempt to make it not multi-volume. We could do it like 3 volumes, 10 volumes of writing, but we needed to condense the major topics, the major stories into one volume. And that is also another important novelty in this book. This is a book written from a constructivist point of view, from the approach which deals not only with the diplomatic exchanges and even not only with the technological transfers, while both are represented there, but also with as a vision that two societies had and developed about each other, and how this vision, images of the other country, helped Russians to understand not only America but Russia, and vision of Russia helped or prevented Americans from understanding themselves and understanding Russia. So that's constructivist point of view, where vision of the other connected to the question who we are in those countries. Who are we? That is another important novelty, important news about our book. So I will probably stop here. Maybe David will develop or add something, or
Well, I'll be very brief because I think, Paula, you plan to ask us some specific questions to go into some more depth. So the one thing that I would really emphasize is that I think not only pundits but also prominent experts on Russia and the United States today have the view that the United States and Russia have always been enemies. One leading scholar, for example, declared that there is no history of a sustained good relationship between the United States and Russia ever, which completely ignores the whole history of the 19th century and the American-Russian friendship in that period. An equally prominent figure took the view that the contemporary clash of Ukraine is something normal in the history of U.S.-Russian relations, that Cold Wars, that's typical. And so this is something that we very much argue against in our book, that empirically, factually, that perspective is wrong. And it leads to an extremely pessimistic view that projects into the indefinite future the contemporary situation, which is, I would say, a recurring problem in major histories. So Ivan mentioned one particular comprehensive survey of U.S.-Russian relations by John Lewis Gaddis, but actually there have been several other broad surveys of the whole history of American-Russian relations by Foster Rea Dulles, by Robert Daniels, by Russian scholars as well, and almost all of them make the mistake of assuming that the present moment is the culmination of all of the previous history, and it is the foreshadowing of the future history of relations. And that is something that we set out in our introduction as something that we try to avoid as a mistake in our work, of assuming that because the current relationship is very positive, as it was for Foster Rea Dulles during the Second World War in the period of Grand Alliance, there's the assumption that that's the natural state of U.S.-Russian relations, is to have harmony and even alliance between the two countries. Or to take the view that because relations are hostile and there is a Cold War, that's the inevitable course of relations in the future. So we attempt to tell a story that is empirically accurate, factually grounded, and avoids the temptation to flatten the whole history of the relations between the United States and Russia, which is actually much more interesting and really fascinating when you open it up to examination beyond the ideological blinders and beyond the sort of static conceptions that have unfortunately been so common.
Yeah, I completely agree. This is extremely interesting. Yeah, we tend to think that rivalry is the natural state, right, of the U.S. and Russia. But the truth is that there's always back and forth. There's always been there's been good relations. There's been bad relations. It all really depends on the lens through which we look at it, and it really depends on the period in history that we're looking at, right? So I prepared this question for Professor Kurila. So yeah, as you guys both just mentioned, you know, there tends to be this dynamic where one of the parts, let's say the U.S., portrays the other, portrays Russia in a certain way. And in this sense, they tend to build their own identity, right? Like they build this discourse or this narrative of the enemy, or everything that the other is not, then I am, you know, there's this mirroring going on. So my question for Professor Kurila is, in your work, specifically in this book, you discussed that there is this cycle of mutual observation, right, of the other. And this mutual observation is a tool for self-definition. So in this book of Distant Friends and Intimate Enemies, were there any specific, very specific historical moments? I know we've already just mentioned them briefly, right? But where this mirroring led to friendship and to mutual understanding, or has it been mostly rivalry, right? Has this mirroring been useful and, beneficial for both of the parties?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for a question. I would start saying that just there is no other way to explain and understand the other but by comparison. That's we don't have any other tool but to say that what we see in another country is like what we have here. And that's leads in both ways. It can lead to misunderstanding. It can lead to better understanding. And I wrote the earliest, chronologically earliest portion of the book. That's from first context through the sale of Alaska. And they can say, that was a lot of comparisons of territorial expansion, for instance. Americans and Russians were expanding. Russia expanding through east, through Siberia, and south to former Ottoman Empire, to Caucasus, to Central Asia. When the United States at the same time, or more or less at the same time, expanded westward towards the Pacific Ocean and towards Mexico, that was. And to explain what was going on, to understand each other, journalists, politicians, travelers, writers, those who were interested in other country, they describe it. What is going on? It's exactly what we have in our country. So it made the processes in the other country similar, made it more understandable. It sometimes led to misunderstanding because some of the particulars in two situations were not the same. But without these comparisons, it would be probably impossible to understand each other. Or the most important point of comparison in the 19th century, or first half of the 19th century, serfdom and slavery. Russia was a country which had a serfdom, and the United States had a slavery of African Americans. And that was a very important point of comparison, especially by the 1850s. And the countries, those who defended slavery in America, those who defended serfdom in Russia, and those who criticized and fought against these institutions, both sides use the other country and they use the example of other country as a tool, as a rhetorical tool to substantiate their position. So those who defend it say, you see, this is a great country and they have serfdom and that's okay with them. So we also can have slavery. Those who criticize said, look at that country, look how bad it's for morale, for economics, for policies in America, and it's exactly what we have here in Russia, and vice versa. So this comparison always can work both ways as a tool to understand, for understanding, and sometimes it leads to misunderstanding of each other. So that's a lot of through all of the history of our relations. It always, all of this comparison always very used for political purposes, but in wide sense of the political, yeah. But it's also helped or prevented better understanding, and you cannot predict what will be used the next day. That's my answer.
Perfect. Sounds interesting. Yeah, I think this makes a lot of sense. And it's actually linked to my next question to Professor David Folksong. So yeah, like you mentioned, Professor Ivan Krila, there's these chapters covering the late 19th century and the 20th century in its beginning, and about how there's these like different things that one party criticizes about the other, and then the other criticizes about the first one, right? Like maybe Russia criticizing slavery and social inequality in the US back in the day. And, it's something that never disappears, but this transforms, right? But back in the day, that criticizing that racial and social inequality, and then the US criticizing autocracy, right, in Russia. Well, there's these two like mutually constitutive others, but Professor David Folgesong, would you believe that the US and Russia need these criticisms to avoid looking into oneself? Like, are these some mechanisms to just criticize the other and like get rid of inner criticism, looking at the mistakes that the other commits instead of just judging internally what one is doing wrong?
Well, I do think that that's been an important recurring theme. For example, American criticism of Russia in the late 19th century and the early 20th century often focused on anti-Semitic pogroms in Russia. and I think it can be demonstrated that serve the function of deflecting attention away from the lynching and segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans in the United States. And one of the ways that we can see that is that people who are formerly abolitionists and who actually cared very deeply about the well-being of African Americans in the United States, when they came to a point of deciding that that was no longer the responsibility of people in the north of the United States, that coincided with a period of an upsurge in their demonization, not only of the Russian autocracy, but also of pogroms in imperial Russia. So I do think that we can see that dynamic at work in the United States. On the other side, not only imperial Russian, but also in the Soviet period, criticism of American racism and extreme materialism and inequality and crass consumer culture have served to affirm Russia's supposed spiritual superiority, cultural superiority, greater degree of equality, supposed freedom from racism. So in all of these areas, you get into elements of, mythological self-conceptions, exaggerations of your own virtue, but it does serve the dynamic of deflecting attention to internal flaws and emphasizing and maybe exaggerating the flaws in the foreign society. I do think that sometimes a positive purpose has been served. For example, Soviet propaganda about race relations in the United States, particularly in the 1950s and early 1960s, did serve the function of calling the attention of top political leaders in the United States to the propaganda cost to them in terms of the world image of the United States, of race relations inside the United States. And I think, as Mary Dudziak has shown, that contributed to the movement of political leaders in the United States, particularly John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, to a greater degree of support for the civil rights movement and for civil rights legislation, being more courageous in confronting Southern segregationists and in pushing through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act than they otherwise would have been inclined to do. If they were not getting a big black eye for the United States in the international propaganda competition of the Cold War, they probably would not have as energetically supported the civil rights movement in that period. But on the whole, I would say that our argument in the book is that this dynamic of deflecting attention away from internal flaws and affirming your own supposed special virtue by contrast to the other has had a negative impact on the history of American-Russian relations. It's inflamed or exaggerated, exacerbated tensions and made it more difficult for the two countries to cooperate in areas where there are common interests.
Thank you for that excellent answer. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think this battle in the media and, all these propaganda just, pushes the other side to act a certain way sometimes, right? It's some pressure. Inevitably, the media is a very important non-state actor, it's always been, I would say. So yeah, my next question is to Professor Ivan Kirilla. It's connected to a certain extent to what we've been discussing, right? So we know that historically, both the US and Russia, they've relied on a sense of belief that they have a unique mission for the world, in the world, and for the world. So based on the research you've made and based on also the insights from this book, would you say that these two beliefs of a unique mission in the world only clash? Or do they also, could they coexist? Is there a possibility for them to coexist with one another without wanting to convert the other? Would you say that's a possibility?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for the question. Yes, it's tempting to say that two competing missions lead to rivalry. And probably if you look on the 20th century, and David knows better than I do, it's his part, that was during the 20th century, this ideological, these two missions led to ideological rivalry, which shaped a lot in the Russian-American relations or Soviet-American relations, while still I would say it was not only, well, probably predominantly in the 20th century, but not only led to rivalry. We know that when Bolsheviks started the revolution and, the early Lenin approaches to and again, David may correct me because he wrote that part, but yes, that was an vision from some of the Bolshevik leaders that the United States is a country which close to some, paradoxically, counterintuitively close to the young Soviet Republic, because America is also the country which emerged from a great revolution. And somehow that makes it closer to the Soviet, to young Soviet Republic. So that was also the mission, a different kind of mission, but it was not only, it did not predetermine the immediate rivalry. So it was not true even in the 20th century, not only possible result in the 20th century. But if you look back, if you look in the early 19th century, that was even more more complex. That when first diplomatic relations were established between Russia and the United States, and that was 1807. The preliminary discussions were taking place when Thomas Jefferson was American president and young Alexander I was Russian emperor. And that was, Thomas Jefferson believed that Alexander I is a liberal monarch, and this is the only liberal monarch of Europe. And because of the Napoleonic Wars, he considered himself a liberating, Russia having a liberating mission towards Europe. And that was a lot of in common, as he understood it, that both America and Russia at that early stage was considered to be liberators, which is hard to believe looking from the 21st century. But then at the early 19th century, it was still there. And certainly we all know, the later European visions. For Europeans, Russia and the United States already for centuries represented like two extremes, two different options for themselves. It probably started with Napoleon. Napoleon once said that in 20 years, Europe will be either Republican or Cossack. Meaning either Americanized or Russianized. And that was and then Tocqueville, who famously compared or predicted that in 100 years, Russia and the United States will divide the whole world between each other. So these European visions will continue again and again, and that is probably more European than Russians or American visions. I've seen more European fears in this comparison of two missions on the both sides of Europe, then it was part of the domestic agenda or domestic discourse in two countries, which is also interesting phenomenon, at least for the 19th century. Again, Cold War, of course, provide us with a different story. Well, probably this is my attempt to answer this very complex and difficult question. Thanks.
Yeah, can I jump in on that, Paula? Because I think Yvonne makes some important points about the political dimension and the idea of liberation. But there are also other terms that we can throw into the discussion. And one big term is civilization. And another big term is Christian or Christianization. So there are ways in which the two countries could conceive of each other as being alike, and in the process then affirming what their own identity is. So we are great, not only liberating but also expanding, civilizing, and Christianizing force in the world, and so are they. And that's great, and that's wonderful. The best illustration of all of this that I think I've ever seen is a political cartoon of Tsar Alexander II from the time of the Russo-Turkish War, in which the United States image of Alexander II is the great yes, liberator of this, but of the Christian Slavs of Eastern Europe, the liberator in that sense. So as a Christian crusader, and as an agent of the civilizing mission against the terrible Turk, the Ottoman, who was the great bloody foe. So there are examples like that of where there is an other, but the other is seen as similar to and moving along a parallel path to the self, and that serves to affirm your self-image.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. Yeah, indeed. There's a lot of things that, in which both Russia and the former Soviet space and the former Russian Empire might, make sense or might find some middle ground and something that they have in common with the US and the whole idea of, being leaders for their own spheres of influence and, expanding, like you guys both mentioned, right, towards the during the period of colonization when both countries were expanding. There was the South, there was the West, there was the East. So there's a lot of things that they can also find in common in the essence, of both projects of state. So, well, my next question is actually again for you, Professor David. So there's this concept of talking about the Cold War as if it had never ended, right? As if we were going through a new Cold War. And like Professor Ivan Kurila mentioned, there's this fight for spheres of influence and this fear in Europe and, the Eastern influence and the Western influence and this whole concept of this rivalry of ideologies that has never died and it's now very relevant. So would you say, this is a question, up to you, whatever you would like to say. It's, of course, a very complex topic, but do you believe the US has finally abandoned, this pursuit to free Russia? Or would you say, the current policy that we're experiencing is just another phase of this pursuing, that same mission?
Yeah, well, you started from the new Cold War, so let me take that up first, and then answer the latter part of
Sure.
your question. The new Cold War, that could be the topic for an entire webinar.
Book.
We could talk for hours about that. It's addressed in detail in the last chapter of our book, which emphasizes, among other things, clashes on Russia's periphery over Georgia as well as over Ukraine. It emphasizes accusations about Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election in the United States. It highlights the exaggerated claims that President Trump was Putin's puppet. But above all, it challenges the common notion that the explanation for the new Cold War is that the evil Vladimir Putin came to power in Russia, and that once that happened, confrontation and conflict between the United States and Russia were inevitable. It's certainly true that Putin, particularly since 2012, has done much to increase friction, tension, conflict between the two countries. But there's a danger, and it's a common failing, I think, to forget about the way that Putin, when he first became the top leader of Russia, was very much interested in a strategic and economic partnership, not only with George W. Bush, who he supposedly bamboozled about his soul, but also with regard to Bill Clinton when he first came into office in 2000. So we try to sketch a more complex picture of how the potential for a strategic and economic partnership was destroyed by actions by both sides, not just because there was an evil ruler in the Kremlin who didn't have a soul, as some American leaders have claimed, but actually that there's a very complex series of events involving, for example, the expansion of the NATO alliance, the promotion by the United States of admission to NATO of Ukraine and Georgia, the deployment of missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, and so on. So it's a more complicated picture than is often reduced to by American pundits. Now, to come to the second part of your question, I think it's certainly true that the current Trump administration shows no interest in liberating Russia from the grip of the current tyrant. And that includes Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who, when he was a United States Senator, sharply expressed hostility to Putin. For example, calling him a war criminal for the bombing of Aleppo in Syria. But nowadays, both Rubio and Trump show much more interest in negotiation and cooperation with Russia. That doesn't mean that the United States as a whole has finally abandoned the pursuit of a free Russia, as you put it in your question. Some very high-profile American commentators, including, for example, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia and now Stanford professor of political science, Michael McFaul, continue to be very much focused on the ideological conflict between autocracy and democracy, and committed, as he puts it in his recent book about autocrats and democrats, committed to being in the fight for freedom forever. That's a lifetime calling for individuals like that. And I think McFaul is not alone. I think we also find figures like that elsewhere in the academic world and in the political world, for example, in the United States Congress. In the early phases of Russia's horrible current war against Ukraine, there were very prominent voices arguing that Russia was going to be defeated in its war in Ukraine, and that defeat would lead to the decolonization of Russia and to the liberation of Russia. So, for example, this is the argument of the former chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov and the former tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky in an article in the very prominent establishment journal Foreign Affairs in January of 2023. That's their vision. By backing Ukraine, we're going to defeat Russia in the war, and because of the defeat, Putin is going to be overthrown and Russia will be liberated. And not coincidentally, Russian exiles like Kasparov and Khodorkovsky will have an opportunity to be the new leaders of Russia, and others will be purged and excluded from the franchise. But those kinds of voices, which were prominent in 2022 and 2023, are not so prominent and not so audible today. That doesn't necessarily mean, just because those voices have temporarily been silenced, that doesn't necessarily mean that enthusiasm about a mission to free Russia has forever been abandoned and is never going to be resurged. So I think one of the recurring and important themes of our book is the way that there are phases. And Yvonne and Victoria did a nice job in their first draft for the conclusion of our book of talking about cycles and recurring dynamics. One of the recurring themes in our book is how American messianic ambitions in relationship to Russia, the drive to liberate, convert, free, transform Russia, have seemed at some times to fade or subside, but then they come back. An example of that would be the 1960s and early 1970s, when in the period of détente, the aspiration to liberate Russia certainly declined in the United States. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson more interested, for example, in bridge building and possibilities for cooperation and arms control, while the United States is engaged in the Vietnam War. But after the Vietnam War ended, this drive to simultaneously demonize and to liberate the Soviet Union comes roaring back in the second half of the 1970s, with Ronald Reagan a leading figure in that drive in the late 1970s. So I think the point would be that it looks now like the mission has subsided or receded. But based on history, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that that's something that we should forecast into the future as forever the case.
Perfect. And
Can I very briefly jump in as
please.
David did? As a Russian citizen, yeah, I tend to say that Mr. Putin is evil, yeah. But as a scholar, I do agree and do support the idea that the whole situation is much more complex. And Mr. Putin certainly, in his strive to keep power, especially since 2012, David was very correct saying that it was a big change. Increase the hostility. He actually used this anti-Americanism that was not the first time in Russian-American relations, when all the critics of Mr. Putin were labeled foreign agent. Oh, by the way, I am also foreign agent according to Russian law. So that's because, somehow Americans interfere into Russian affairs, and everybody who are against Putin, that's foreign agents. It's exactly like, it happened again and again. So I would say, but to say that this is only Mr. Putin's problem, it will be not just. I agree with David that, again, especially if you look not only from his first years, but look the missed opportunities in the early 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I see there a lot of lost opportunities from the part of the West, or of the United States, when the Russia was looking for a new identity after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It did not find enough support or enough openness from the part of the West. So that was also some roots of the contemporary situation. But it does not mean that that we say that Putin is innocent. Well, Putin is evil, but yes, but that's not only him. That's my jump in. Sorry,
No, thank you so much. That makes perfect sense because, there's especially, I would say there's a specific role that this aim to convert Russia and free Russia and liberate Russia and make Russia do the right thing, I think that's what angers Russia a lot of the time. And that's something that's made, tensions escalate progressively over history, especially over the last 20, 30 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think it's on point. Your comments perfectly on point. So yeah, I agree fully. By the way, to our audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to write those questions in the Q&A section. Towards the end of the webinar, I'm going to be reading those questions out loud for our panelists to respond. So this is your chance, this is your opportunity to ask questions to our first level panelists today and get an opportunity to get them answered, right? So our next question is concerning your whole, job, your whole research, Professor Ivan Kyriles. So, you tend to normally say that history should be a dialogue, right? That history should not be monopolized, that there should be some back and forth, some feedback. And you say that monopolizing history actually destroys the ability to imagine a different future and to, bring different perspectives to the equation. What would you say are some mechanisms to make this dialogue and this exchange possible? Not specifically in Russia, not just in Russia, but in general, all over the world.
Well, yeah, thank you for your question. Well, it's a big, wider than just Russian history of Russian-American relations, but definitely it's also pertained to also deals with this field. I would say, first of all, what I mean by saying that history is a dialogue. History is a dialogue because it's always we ask questions from our generation. We ask to the past the questions which are interesting for us, which are which forms our own agendas, our own problems, our own vulnerabilities. But we look for answers in the historical sources. We use these historical sources, the voices of the past, as a way to answer our questions. And by the way, this is a reason why history is rewritten with each generation. It's not because our predecessors were bad, They just ask different questions, different type of questions. Their generation had different problems, so this is a history as a dialogue. And looking from this, we have a problem. Who can ask the question from a contemporary? And we have a very diverse, pluralistic societies. If we monopolize, back in the 19th century, the whole history was a history of the states, nation states. The nation state was a monopoly, the only participant of the dialogue from the contemporary. And now we have very diverse societies. We have different dialogues which are going on simultaneously. And that's pluralism is actually important thing in our dealing with the past. That's why we have different types of history written simultaneously. And what we see in Russia, for instance, we see that the state is attempting to monopolize questions. That's more and more restrictions on the history writing in Russia, more and more restrictions on the asking the questions to the past. And that's actually is a problem. And I would say we have simultaneously two dialogues. One dialogue is a dialogue of contemporary with the past, and another is a dialogue between us in the contemporary world. And those two dialogues are interconnected, dependent on each other. So pluralism in the contemporary society is also the guarantee of the productive dialogue with the past. But the existence of a different simultaneous discussion with the past, different dialogues with the past, is also the tool to save the contemporary pluralism. So that's important. And the dialogue between the states or between the nations, dialogue between the Russians and Americans in the past, is also part of our understanding of it helps us to understand our own societies, not only the other society, but our own society. Americans understand their society, Russians understand their society. And without the depth of the historical background, without triangulation, as some geometer will say, probably triangulation between our position, our dialogue with each other, and our dialogue with the past encounters of each other, we will not understand what is going on and what we should expect. And that's why I hope that our book providing this depth of the contemporary dialogue. It's not only our dialogue with the past, but it's a depth of the contemporary dialogue between the nations, between people on different sides of the Atlantic. So I tried to make it short, but yeah, thank you.
No, yeah, I agree. I think the way you talk about your past determines your present, right? And it determines your future, most importantly. So, yeah, until we have a healthy relationship with our past and we are able to include different perspectives and, like you said, pluralism, discussions into the way we perceive our past, we will be able to dictate, a more accurate and brighter and better version of our futures. So, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now for Professor David, so there's this question on, well, you've written in your past work about American and Soviet women as citizen diplomats, which is very relevant, today because East-West Connections focuses on citizen diplomacy. So the way in which citizens, have the power of hosting these dialogues, these type of discussions, to participate in the way we build our present and our future. So the question is, would you say that in today's both digital and physical isolation that we see between Russia and the US, would you say bottom-up de-escalation is still possible? Or would you say that the state-led narratives are just too powerful now for everyday citizens to overcome?
Paula, I want to compliment you that you've done a beautiful job of organizing these questions and creating a transition here, going from the question about dialogue to Yvonne to now talking about dialogue in the context of citizen exchanges. And the first thing I would say is, I hadn't thought of this before, but when you bring up dialogue, one of the interesting things that happened in the 1980s is there was an expansion of academic dialogue, so that even George F. Kennan, who had been a very harsh critic of Soviet historians in the late 1950s and early 1960s, even George F. Kennan participated in 1984 in a major dialogue between leading American historians and leading Soviet historians. And that is actually, I think, a process, part of the process of overcoming the really sharp division between American and Soviet historical perspectives at that period of time. I'm very glad that you asked about the citizen diplomacy of the 1980s, which I think is not very well appreciated in the United States. That there is a tendency to think either we won the Cold War, Reagan won the Cold War, or maybe some people say Gorbachev took the initiatives that brought about the ending of the Cold War. Our understanding of that process, which is a really important turning point in history, has been skewed by sort of great man interpretation that emphasizes the roles of either Ronald Reagan or Gorbachev, or the interaction between them. And so it's not only women's groups, but it's also many other American and Russian people who become involved in very ambitious, unprecedentedly ambitious exchanges. So that means American Christians contacting and developing connections with Christians in the Soviet Union in order to challenge the notion that the Soviet Union is a land of godless communism. So that's one kind of exchange. Doctors become involved in exchanges. Evgeny Chazov in the Soviet Union, Bernard Lown in the United States being the two most prominent figures, but they organized something called the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW, which wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985, and scientists and others. So these exchanges, women play a leading role. That's true, but it's much broader than that. And they did exert an important influence because they humanized the demonic adversary by bringing Soviet citizens to the United States and by having larger numbers of Americans traveling to the Soviet Union. They made it much more difficult for ideologues to construct a demonic image of the other, because you've got the woman or the doctor or the scientist in the room at the high school auditorium. And at that face-to-face level, it's very difficult to construct the image of the terrible Russian bear or the demonic American militaristic machine going all the way around the world. So yeah, I'm very glad that you asked about that. But your question fundamentally was about is there no hope for that today? Mm-hmm. Well, there are some exchanges going on today. There was a group in the 1980s called the Center for Citizen Initiatives, and it still exists today, but it is much less active, and as far as I know, is having much less of a positive impact. I'd be interested in learning more about what East-West Connections is doing. We do know that Representative Anna Paulina Luna of Florida, a Republican, recently invited a delegation of Russian legislators or lawmakers to come to Capitol Hill. But that's, I think, a pretty unusual case in the recent times. And even that episode provoked very sharp criticism by other members of Congress of bringing the enemy to the United States. And we prefer to keep the enemy as the pariah, as distant, and to bring them. Oh my God, yeah. So
too
that's
extremely
controversial and very problematic. I would also say that I think it's actually dangerous now to conduct the kind of citizen exchanges that were undertaken in the 1980s because of the danger of people actually being arrested in going to the country of the supposed enemy. So I think in the near term, it's unlikely that there's going to be a renewal of the kind of very broad-scale, ambitious citizen exchanges that happened in the 1980s. But nonetheless, I think it's worth remembering as a sort of inspiration what did happen in the 1980s and how citizens at that time very courageously took the initiative, at great personal risk. A woman named Betty Bumpers, founder of a group called Peace Links, Women Against Nuclear War, after she organized one of her first events in the Washington, D.C. area, Senator Jeremiah Denton of Alabama, a Vietnam War veteran, got up on the floor of the United States Senate and denounced her group as a communist front organization. And Betty Bumper's husband, Dale Bumpers, had the perfect retort to that, because he stood up on the floor of the United States Senate and said to Senator Denton, "Peace Links was not formed in the Kremlin. Peace Links was born in my kitchen."
Like all good things, like kitchen talks, kitchen conversations late at night. Wow. Yeah, I think what is left is to have these conversations, to not let these conversations die and to stimulate these exchanges. Because I think that's, a very easy, not super easy way, but like a way of keeping, that participation alive and those exchanges alive and relevant, especially now that we need them the most, right? It's not just accurate to say that one side's wrong, the other one's right. It's always way more complicated than that. Even if we had 5 of these webinars, we wouldn't finish. We would just be scratching the surface of, how deep these issues are. So yeah, I think what is left is to keep on having conversations and, asking questions. Would you guys like to add anything else before we move on to the Q&A, the questions that our assistants have been very kind to ask? What do you say? Should we get started with the questions?
Yeah, let's hear what other people have to say. We've talked enough.
Perfect. So our first question says, what role does the knowledge by both countries of the ever-rising global temperatures play in driving our competition and also our cooperation? So it has to do with climate change, right? Either Professor David or Professor Ivan, whoever feels, the most comfortable to respond to the question.
Well, not
Ivan,
exactly.
go ahead.
Yeah, not exactly my kind of expertise about the questions about the climate change and the future. Well, what I've seen recently, it looks like both countries, or at least current leadership of the both countries, are skeptical towards the global climate change, or not to the global climate change, but skeptical towards the possibility of stopping it. So it looks more like they are turning the interest to, I would say, to Arctic, and we see both Putin and Trump are, expressed a lot of interest in the northern regions in the recent years, and that's probably the result of the climate change and the global warming, which is not exactly the well, it's a kind of a new geographical region of competition. That's something in the Arctic Ocean or something, Greenland or whatever. Russia. It's probably driven by this vision of the future. But that's again not my part of expertise. I know more about the history of the 19th century than I know about the future of the 22nd century. So, but that's my short attempt to say something.
Well, let me come at this in 2 ways. One would be to point out that when the Cold War was ending, when the mutual demonization was ending in the late 1980s, one of the themes that emerged, surprisingly, in Soviet propaganda, in the illustrated magazine Krokodil, is of the necessity for the great powers, and they meant the United States, the Soviet Union, and they added generously into the picture the United Kingdom, should cooperate in dealing with the problem of the thinning of the ozone layer. So this was an example of the vision of shifting from competition and conflict towards cooperation, and the dealing with the problem of the thinning of the ozone layer, and therefore challenges, environmental challenges, was one of the dimensions in the late 1980s, which is an interesting and I think understudied area of cooperation among environmental activists in East and West in that period of the ending of the 1980s. But to come at this another way, one of the key areas, of course, for talking about problems of climate change centers on the Arctic. And there we see in our mass media a great deal of emphasis on competition and how the United States needs to be building more icebreakers, and how Russia and even China are threatening American access to the sea lanes and the resources of the region. So there's a kind of journalistic and even, I'm sorry to say, sometimes academic hype of conflict and competition as the main theme for the Arctic. Whereas I think more level-headed scholars like Elizabeth Buchanan in a book called The Red Arctic, Russian Strategy Under Putin, and the political scientist Robert English from the University of Southern California has emphasized that actually, if you look at it, there have been extensive exchanges in the Arctic Council that are involving multiple powers that are geared towards cooperation in the Arctic and not towards the militarization of the region and the escalation of conflict and tensions in the region. So this gets back, Paula, to your point about the importance of the media and the often negative role that the media plays in inflaming tensions and in sensationalizing competition and conflict. And one of the things I would just my final thing I'll say about this is one of the things that the citizen activists did very effectively in the 1980s is to create stories for the media to focus on that were positive stories about cooperation and exchange and dialogue. One simple way to do that was to bring an unprecedentedly large number of Soviet citizens to visit Pelican Rapids, Minnesota, or Mountain Home, Arkansas, middle America, and therefore to get not the local newspaper editor and the local radio station and the regional television network to cover this unprecedented event of Soviet visitors coming to the United States. So that's an example of how citizen activists can try to turn around the way that the media deals with the topic, and something worth, I think, remembering today.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your answer. Very complete. Now we have a different question that says the 1943 Warner Bros. Propaganda film Mission to Moscow is now being showed on HBO. Can you comment on the motivations for the US to have this film produced?
David, will you tell us? Because it's I have an answer, but I guess you know better. Is it?
Okay, well,
It's
so
Joseph Davis' book, first of all, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So 1943 Mission to Moscow. We know what happened with regard to that. So as Yvonne rightly mentions, the former U.S. ambassador Joseph E. Davis wrote a memoir with the same title that the movie is used. The movie goes even further overboard in portraying Stalin in favorable terms. We know that this fit the agenda of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, and that this is a time when there was active cooperation between the United States government and the Office of War Information and Hollywood studios. And later, they would pay a price for this. And one of the first targets of the post-1945 Red Scare and the House Un-American Activities Committee will be to go into Hollywood and to investigate the pro-red, pro-communist, pro-Soviet films of the 1940s, the World War II period. Not only Mission to Moscow, but the North Star with Lillian Hellman as a script, Song of Russia. There's a whole array of World War II era films that are telling a very positive story about the Russian war effort and how Russians are not evil villains, but they are heroic people and they love their Soviet system, and they should always be our friends.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Anything to add, Professor Ivan? No?
Well, it's sometimes I as a scholar of Russian American relations, as a personally connected to both countries, I always wanted the relations would be better. But sometimes the propaganda which used for this, for the good reason, I want for the good purpose, It's well, sometimes I did not like how they use it, and this is one of the reasons. One why, uh, when some propaganda machine, Russian or American propaganda machine, uses lie, uses direct, distortion of the situation, it does not work in the long run. It does not work for the better. It did work. This movie did work briefly for the 1943 when it was aired, but in the long run, it's probably served to the opposite, to the opposite goal. And I would think that, well, we should be just attentive to propaganda, but on the same time not think that if propaganda is attempting to convince us in something, that it's definitely the whole idea is wrong. And propaganda sometimes emphasizes and sometimes uses, well, has its own purposes to be in place. But again, it does not mean that the whole idea always bad. The idea of Russian-American friendship is, I would say, is good idea, but just do not try to make it in such a way. And this, the question was why it's now aired on the HBO. Probably somebody, I don't know, in HBO was want to return to end the cycle and to return the relations to the better one. But we just don't should not use old propaganda tricks to do it. I mean, we have
Yeah.
a lot of correct true sides to convince and to use. That's
Yeah, Paula, we could have a whole webinar about movies and American Russian or US Soviet relations. And one thing that I'll just toss in here is if you want to think about how movies reflect change in US Russian relations, think about the difference between the American film Red Dawn in 1984 that envisions a Soviet / Cuban / Nicaraguan invasion of the United States, Red Dawn, 1984, and Red Heat, 1988, in which Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jim Belushi play a Soviet and American cops, police officers, and now they are cooperating. Now they are partners. Only 4 years separating those two films, which is a reflection then of a major theme of our book of not constancy, but change and fluctuation and volatility in the whole history of American-Russian relations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your answers. Perfect. Our next question is still even more complicated. Steven's asking, how will the Russian-Ukrainian war end?
I wish I know. I don't know. Sorry.
If only we knew, right? Any forecasts? Anything to say? This is just too complex, but
I try to be a historical optimist, but this is too serious. I'm just, I will not. I hope it will end sooner. I will hope they will know more. But yeah, this is just hopes. It's not a prediction. That's
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that either, but what I would highlight is the way that the dominant theme among US experts on Russia for a long period of time has been just one more new weapon system. Send in the Sherman tanks or the F-16s or the long range missiles. One more weapon system is going to turn the tide, and that's been said over and over and over again by leading American, I would say, by the vast majority of U.S. experts on Russia, and I think they have been proved wrong. And so I think we should pay more attention to voices like those of Samuel Sharap, who have been arguing from the beginning that there is an important role to be played by dialogue and negotiation, and that the deployment of one more new weapon system is going to change the structure of the situation. I think that's been shown to be a recurring illusion.
perfect. Thank you very much. Our next question is from Natalia Krylova, and she says, thank you for the great and thought-provoking talk. My question is not about the past, but rather about the future. In the past, when asked about my Russian accent, I'd occasionally joke that I was raised in the evil empire, quotations. Lately, however, I've noticed Americans often respond with a rhetorical, which one? Given that Russia and the US seem to have dangerously synced these days in their historical trajectories, both occupying that unique niche of the alternative Europe, is there a possibility that these two powers could eventually integrate their shared turbulent experiences into a new model for a brave new world, or are they destined to remain parallel outliers?
Yvonne, that sounds like a question for you.
Well, it's the question has an evil empire, and I would remind the people that the previous book by David had evil empire and that as a part of the title, American Mission and the Evil Empire. So that's a great book about that. So I will, but I will, I can start. That was Ronald Reagan famous, saying that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. And a few years later, when being in the Red Square in Moscow, journalist asked Ronald Reagan if he still considered Russia, Soviet Union, this evil empire, and he said no. But you know what is interesting? If the Soviet Union ceased to be an evil empire, it means that the United States ceased to be Jedis. If you evil empire means that America, we are on the right side of history, and the Soviet Union was definitely on the wrong side of history. If the Soviet Union stopped to be evil empire, that means that Americans also stopped to be the knights of light, and that was one of the turning point into American. Well, I say that's my maybe I'm wrong, but this was the end of the Cold War, was a beginning of the evolution of the United States, of American domestic policies and international policies. Without the big other, like the Soviet Union, the American domestic affairs lost this constitutive other. And American foreign policy lost the balance. And that's actually was a first step toward what we have now, this international nightmare we witness. I don't think that Russia and the United States will make some, I don't know, sync their trajectories. It's still very different countries and very different, and we still use each other as other, yeah, as other from a capital O. But what we have now is at some point is a consequences of the end of the Cold War and is an ability to create, to think about the alternative domestically, internationally. That's we still don't have new language to explain where we are. That's why we still use this new Cold War. This is not Cold War. It's something different, but we don't have words for this. And that's a problem, and that's probably our book is about the past, not about the future. But I hope, I have a very small but modest hope that this is one of the bricks which will help to build this new edifice, a new building of understanding of what we have now. That's my attempt. David, you probably have more to say.
Well, on the evil empire, I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not good at forecasting the future. And in fact, as I mentioned before, I think one of the themes of our book is refraining from trying to forecast the future and to emphasize contingency and multiple possibilities. But on this point about evil empire, I think it's worth remembering that this was not something that evaporated spontaneously, that people deliberately worked to challenge the notion of the other as an enemy and as an evil empire. So Ronald Reagan's phrase from March of 1983 got a lot of attention. The citizen activists in the early and mid 1980s were deliberately seeking to challenge that notion, that representation of the Soviet Union. And we know that Gorbachev specifically, directly asked Secretary of State George Shultz that if Ronald Reagan no longer believed the Soviet Union was an evil empire, he should say so. And he did. Prompted by a journalist at the end of May in 1988, he put his arm around Gorbachev on Red Square and said, no, that was another era. 5 years earlier was another era. That was another time. This was a deliberate effort by Gorbachev and his advisors, particularly Georgy Arbatov, to take away the American image of the Soviet Union as an enemy. Arbatov would go all around the United States giving talks and appear on Ted Koppel's Nightline. And he would say, we're going to do something terrible to you Americans. We're going to deprive you of your enemy. So this was not something that just spontaneously happened. This was Arbatov and Gorbachev picking up on a theme that citizen activists had been actively working on from the early 1980s. And by 1988, Arbatov and Gorbachev came to understand how fundamental this would be to change in the dynamics, would be for the Soviet Union no longer to be able to be depicted as the monstrous, evil empire. So from a historical perspective, that's what I would emphasize, that whatever prospects there are for the future, it's not, you can't just pray and hope and wish that someday somebody's going to do something. People took deliberate action in order to confront those stereotypes in the 1980s. And that's, I think, worth remembering today.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your answer. What do you think, Todd? Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, let's go on with, I wished we could keep both Yvonne and David for the next month. But basically, that might not be possible, but please go on. Let's go for a few more minutes.
Okay, perfect. So our next question is about the Journal of Russian American Studies. Could you tell us more about the purpose and the content of this journal?
Go ahead,
Well, well, this is a journal. It's already, well, correct me, 7 or 8 years old, and we organized it. Now, we both, David and I, are members of the editorial board, and this is a journal specifically devoted to the study of Russian-American relations, the history and contemporary issues on the Russian-American relations. It's historical journal. Its journal publishes some studies in literature, less about political stuff, more it's still his history of Russian-American relations, and we publish reviews of the books on the topic. So it's probably the only contemporary academic journal devoted specifically to the study of Russian-American relations and its history. It's important to develop. It's had more and more subscribers, as far as I know. Well, the editor knows better, but he report us every few months that we have increase of subscribers. So those who has something interesting or some idea to write for the journal, please write. That will be even we want to spread the word about the journal. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Perfect. Our next question has to do a lot with Russia. So, what will be the effects of the recent cutting off of the internet in Russia and the closure of Telegram and the use of Macs and the ability to monitor all contact online by both the US and Russia? What would this have on the possibility of dialogue?
Yvonne, this is for you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. First of all, it's certainly the development in Russia getting worse and worse in terms of the contacts with the of the outer world. There are more and more restrictions on the internet, messengers, connections, WhatsApp, Telegram, and other, getting more and more difficult to use. People do use VPN and all different tools to get through the. I'm now in Ohio. I have a lot of friends and relatives back in Russia, so it became more difficult to communicate. We still communicate. We still, have ways to get through. But yeah, the whole. It looks like the regime, the current state attempts to build, Chinese firewall around Russian internet. I don't know if they will successful in doing that, because well, it's already called, in the recent weeks, recent months, we see more and more protests, not only from the liberal part of the society, which is definitely considered an enemy by Mr. Putin, but even from his previous support zone, because messengers is something that everybody use, not only liberals, and that already creates some discontent in Russia. But I don't know if the discontent will continue or will be somehow suppressed. So it's hard to make a prediction. But that's another step to making this regime more, more consolidated. On the other hand, Russian state started to fight, to restrict, to fight against the internet freedoms much later than China did. And so in China, there is a lot of technological decisions how to isolate Chinese people from the dangerous information. In Russia, there is no such a deep building walls, and that makes the whole problem more complicated for the state. And that's a lot of good Russian mathematicians, good Russian IT specialists who are attempting to prevent this development. So this is a battle. This is an internet battle which I can just witness. I am not an IT specialist. I just see how it works. Just a week ago, WhatsApp did not work in Russia. This morning, I talked to my cousin freely through the WhatsApp. I don't know what happened. Something happens every day.
Yeah, I think the difference there is, the China's been, blocked from the outer world's internet for such a long time, but Russia had all this access to the to the internet of the outside world for a really long time, and it's been, progressively being deprived from it. So of course people are not happy, and it's, you can feel it, right?
Yes.
So yeah. Well, and our last question is, I am looking forward to reading the book. There are so many facets that never have been completely explored that may explain the complicated Russian-Soviet dynamic in the 20th century history, the AEF attempt to intervene with the British after the revolution on the Murmansk front, the American famine relief in 1921, the numerous Americans who moved to the USSR between the 30s and the 1936 for the promise of something better than the Depression, and of course the role of Lend-Lease. Only the role of the AEF and the BEF taking the side of the White Army have ever been addressed by 20th century and modern era Russian historians, outside of Volkogonov and a few others. Is this part of the complicated historical dynamic? No, yeah. Is this the part of the complicated historical dynamic that you addressed in your book?
I think it's David, the question to
David. Well, a number of things were mentioned there. I'm not sure that I agree that Lend-Lease, for example, has not been addressed by Russian historians. I think actually there's been a significant emphasis on the history of Lend-Lease by Russian historians, and more broadly, the economic relations between the United States and Russia in the 1940s has been emphasized by someone whom I know pretty well, Christina Minkova in St. Petersburg. So I'm not sure that I agree with the premise of the question.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't know. It's deep. There's a lot of elements in there. But okay, well, thank you so much for your answers, guys. Thank you so much for this rich discussion. It's been a pleasure to be sharing, different insights about the history of relations between the U.S. and Russia. It's of course a never-ending thing. We just barely scratched the surface. But thank you so much for joining, and it's been a very enriching dialogue. Up to you,
Thank you
Todd.
for hosting it.
Thank you very much.
Listen, one of the difficulties is that every question leads to another question. And it's almost disastrous to raise certain questions that are complex within an hour. In terms of the idea that it's like eating part of a good steak, but leaving the rest, because you couldn't get to it. And, the idea, in fact, the ideas, you started giving me ideas now on the new Cold War and movies as a reflection, which I hadn't thought about, which is really doing, first of all, thank you to everyone that participated, to Paula, to David, and to Yvonne. We are doing a program on April 16th, which is a carry-on of this discussion. There's a brilliant exhibition now going on at the Minneapolis Museum of Russian Art. And it talks about the idea of the tradition of citizen diplomacy in pictures, the Van Cliburn and the other activities that happen that appeared to be so normal during that time, which now appear to be historical and irrelevant to many. But the point is they're extremely relevant. And so we're having Margot Squire and some people from the museum. And for those of us that are here in Minnesota, I hope they have a chance to see it in the next few weeks. But secondly, on the sponsors, basically, who did this program in terms of and I'm going to give a thanks again to Global Minnesota, the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, the Museum of Russian Art, McAllister Department of Russian Studies, and the Journal of Russian American Studies. I want to also note that part of the traditions of this, one of the centers of citizen relationships in the 1980s was in Minnesota. Susan Hartman, who's listening to this program and hopefully is in good health, was the leader and was a brilliant organizer of things that were years ahead of its time, that unfortunately had disappeared until some of the rest of us who were still alive, basically started bringing that concept back. And it's unfortunate that some of those things don't expand. I talk to my friends in Russia on a fairly regular basis. Many of them want to have relationships still. But the phrase that they use is, yes, we want to have these discussions, but number one, being charged as a foreign agent provides some difficulties. Second is the aspect that we want to do this, and then there'll be a pause and it will say, but not at this moment. So the desire is there to be seen as equal. The desire is there to participate in a larger world. And what we're going to do is try and make as many possibilities. In fact, one of the few things you asked about groups, Rotary Russia is probably the last group that's allowed on a regular basis within Russia, which raises other questions, because, any group that's still allowed, there is a governmental decision, as to the purpose of this. So the questions start to be, I can go 10 different directions on this. I would have loved to have a question, on Alexander Dugin, and and the idea of the impact of we're planning a conference for September that I hope to get the two of you involved in, on the idea of civilizational change and the theory of Dugin, which came out of Carl Schmitt, on the idea of Russia's sphere of influence, the United States sphere of influence, and the Chinese, almost like a continuation of 1984. But now is not the time to do that. But one of the points is that the reason that journals like the Journal of Russian American Studies grew, and it hopefully will grow to a much greater extent, is the idea that the questions remain. The questions are important, and they raise other issues which need to be discussed, because if you cannot communicate with the people that you're dealing with, there is no future of relationships. So on that basis, thank you again to the three of you. You were absolutely wonderful. And I want to thank everyone who came, and thank you to the sponsors. And again, to Ben, who basically provide the organization for this. So thank you, and very good night. If you have a chance, come back, please, for April 16th. For all those of you that are listening, there'll be another program which will increase some of the same discussions we've had tonight, but from a different angle. So thank you, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Paula.
Good night.
Thanks,
Thank you,
David.
guys.
Thanks, Ivan.
Okay, good night.
What's
Paula,
your
terrific job.